So you guys can ask the question or you can put it in the chat box, whichever you're more comfortable with.
I got a question, if I can go first.
Sure.
So my friend is scared to get like any vaccine period because he keeps saying that he sees a bunch of these like problems that occur. Like there was this girl who got the vaccine and she started foaming like at the mouth, and then she like was hospitalized later. Is that like an allergy or like something like that?
Okay, that's a great question. So not sure like the context of what happened to her friend, and I'm sorry to hear about that. But I can tell you that in the vast majority, if you look at what happened in the world, as of today, I think there's been over 4.5 billion of doses of the vaccine administered. And it's just not those 3 vaccines that we have in the US, there are other vaccines outside of the United States. And I can tell you that, do we hear those stories? Unfortunately, we may, but I can tell you it's not something that I hear every day. So I don't think that should be enough to not take the vaccine. There's just like, of one bad incident. I know of one car accident that happened last week. I still put my seatbelt and drive.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I just looked it up and I read that immunocompromised people can get the vaccine safely. Can you confirm?
Repeat that, can or cannot? I missed.
Can.
Yes, absolutely. So immunosuppressed patients can get the vaccine safely. And why is that? Is because none of the vaccines currently available in the United States are what we call a live vaccine. So in theory, there's like, 2 ways you can do a vaccine. You can give someone the actual thing, which actually we do that. So for example, if you look at the chickenpox vaccine, which probably most of you guys on the call here got, it's actually the actual virus that they weaken and they give it to you. It's what we call a live vaccine. Now, that would not be a good idea for an immunocompromised host because even though the virus is of reduced activity, there's a chance that what if their immune system is too weak to contain that weakened strain of the virus? However, for COVID, it's none of that. So they can safely get it.
Thank you for you answering my question.
Yeah, no problem. Who's next? You guys seem shy.
Are you currently making a vaccine for the Delta variant, or will the regular COVID vaccine just cover that already?
Yeah, so the regular COVID vaccine does cover that already. So at this time, there's no need for that. What you may be seeing out of the press is that, there's an additional dose that's being planned for people who are immunosuppressed to tie up to the last question. And the reason for that is because their ability to mount antibodies and respond to the vaccine in some cases may be limited. So that's why the CDC is offering them to get an additional dose to kind of like boost their immune response. And then you also hear starting next month that the current administration is planning to give everybody an additional dose that would be 8 months after their second dose of the vaccine. So more to come on that, but that's not because the Delta variant is structurally different. It's just like they realize that over time, the amount of antibodies in the blood of people who got the vaccine kind of weighs down.
I got another question.
Yeah.
So I already forgot it. Hold on. I'm sorry. I lost it.
Uh-oh. What was it? Okay, there's a question. There has been a lot of stories on how COVID started. Do we know how it actually started? That's a great question. There's a lot of what I call like, theories. And I think one of the great news is that a lot of those new infectious disease experts that were on Facebook, now they're political expert about the Middle East. So that maybe weighed down some of the theories. But what's happening is that in theory, how do you get like new virus strains to happen? a lot of times like those things happen when there's like communication between some of the animal world into the human world, and then like you have cross path. In this case, the most scientific theory is that somewhere somehow like this went from the bat world to the human world. And we see it all the time with what I call like influenza. So if you go back to 2009, there was a big epidemic or almost a pandemic of swine flu. And what that was that unfortunately you had like recombination of some of the strain of the virus that can also affect the swine, which is like pork, and also humans. And then that was like a new strain for humans, and it was like a problem. The good news is it was not as transmissible as the COVID. And so it didn't really have the same aftermath as COVID did. But that's not unusual. And to give you a little bit more perspective, don't be surprised if there are more what we call emergent diseases, as we humans would kind of like explore more of the earth, like people were cutting down forests in the Amazonian forest, they're cutting down other places. So there's a chance that you might get exposure to other new viruses or other organisms. So more to come. Why can't people under the age of 12 get the vaccine? Great question. That goes down to how we humans are allowed to do what we call clinical trials. So before a medication gets, in this case, like a vaccine gets to your arm, there are rules and regulations that need to be strictly followed. And the short of it is that, you know, the drug companies have to make sure it's safe. And then after that, they have to make sure that it actually works. And they prove that in key patient populations. Now, one of the problems is that internationally, there are certain things that you just cannot do. So if you're doing a trial, you cannot enroll people who are pregnant, you cannot enroll prisoners, and you cannot enroll kids. That's like highly illegal across the world. Can't do that. So you have to start with consenting adults. And then after that, once you show that, what I call a proof of concept, then you can start slowly enrolling younger individuals. And that's what you see happening with the COVID vaccine. They started enrolling folks that were like from 12 and up, and now there are trials ongoing in the 2 to 11 range. And they have to submit the same kind of data to the FDA and to other organizations across the world before the vaccine can get to kids within that age group. That's unfortunately, or fortunately, I should say, how it works. So that's why. Why the COVID vaccine makes sleepy. So whenever you get a vaccine, not everybody's going to get sleepy, but some people might. It's just based on the immune reaction that's going on inside the body. There are some substances that are secreted in response to the product that may make you feel a little sleepy, or, you know, some people may feel pain where the injection went in. Some people may have a headache. Some people may even have a fever. So the side effect is vary greatly from individual to individual. And then you're always going to have that person, you know, like, I don't know, I'm just going to throw at Joe, like Joe, just like, what are you guys talking about? I took the vaccine, I was completely fine. So there's always going to be that guy too. So you never know when you get the vaccine, what's going to happen. Is it safe for pregnant women to get vaccinated? All the organizations across the world have actually come out and say that it is safe for pregnant women to get the vaccine, but they still say that it's a private conversation between that woman and their OBGYN physician. And then obviously, because of what I said earlier, there's no data about, there's not a lot of data regarding using the vaccine in pregnant women, even though there is now rising data in that group. And then the most important thing to consider is that if you look at the flip side of the story, if someone who's pregnant does get COVID, they are more likely to die from the COVID, or they're more likely to spend quality or non-quality time in the ICU with a tube to support their breathing. So that's where the vaccine comes in handy for someone who's pregnant, because it can actually prevent really bad things from happening. You guys went quiet.
One of the questions in the pre-survey was, why do you have to have 2 shots?
All right, so actually now it's going to be probably 3 with what's coming. But like, you know, every vaccine has like a certain amount of doses that you get, and it's not something that you can think ahead of time. It just depends on how the study and everything was designed to it. And as of now, the COVID vaccines, like at least the mRNA ones, they were scheduled on a 2-dose regimen. And you do have a single dose Johnson & Johnson that was also approved. So for those who like a single dose, you know, and each one has, you know, their side effect profile, but in general, it really depends on, it's like basically you have some medications that you take once a day, and you have some medication that you have to take twice a day, 3 times a day. It all depends on how it was basically designed, and like what something we call the pharmacokinetics, which is really how it interacts with the human body. Things that I'm noticing in the pre-survey is that at least you guys have talk about, like, you know, the tracker, and that's totally myth. If you guys are worried about a tracker, I invite you to shut down all your electronics.
We're not. It's just a
I know.
question, because we hear so many anti-vax Karens talking about it.
Correct. And like, you know, I was just giving you, like, you know, a material to fight back. It would be like those people need to worry, like, you know, shut down their cell phones and other tracking devices that they use every day.
Speaking of, what do you think about anti-vaxxers? I know it must be pretty frustrating to know that people, you know, with like no medical experience think they know better than scientists and doctors and stuff.
No, actually, you know, when the one thing I know is that I don't know enough. So I'm always curious as to what other people are thinking, and then, you know, engage in a conversation and try to have, you know, as long as it's a cordial conversation, it's great. I'm not there to impose my views on anyone, or like you listen to someone and, you know, listen to why they have this and what's their apprehension. And sometimes I don't call it, you know, anti-vaxxer or something. I call it vaccine hesitancy, or someone who may not have like the total knowledge. But for some people, it's basically where they look up their information, and you might sometimes, like, that might be an opportunity to redirect the person to a more reliable source of information. So there's all of that out there, but I wouldn't necessarily put someone like in a column of like do not talk to. I think it's actually a great opportunity to try to have a dialogue. I heard that the vaccine affects PMS symptoms and does it affect the female's menstrual cycle? Is this true? So there was some initial report coming out of the UK initially about that. And I do think that that was something that they noticed. I'm not sure if you can directly allocate that to the vaccine itself, because this would be a much more complicated thing to do, because I'm not an OBGYN person, but I remember from my time, like rotating in that as a med student, this is something that sometimes there were women coming into the office that were very predictable, and there were women where it may have like some variation. So in order to have like causality, you would probably need to design a study where you're essentially looking at people with the vaccine and, you know, the aftermath, and just making sure that there are no other variation that would explain the change in cycle. Why am I saying like that? Is because there were studies done way before the vaccine that, for example, I'm just gonna tell you one example quickly, is that if you have a house with multiple females, eventually what's gonna happen is that their hormonal cycle may sync altogether. And that might be people coming from different cycles, and like eventually it might sync. So there is something that is beyond what probably could be studied that's happening, and that's why I would be careful into saying there's causality. But definitely that has been reported. Will next generation have an option to get the COVID vaccines at their physicals? So That's probably gonna be true because I'm not gonna lie to you guys. Coronaviruses, which is the family that the COVID-19 virus belongs to, coronaviruses have been causing the common cold for centuries, if not for millennials. COVID is not going anywhere, so you guys better get used to it. The only thing we can do with the vaccine is to turn it into a mild cold. But yes, that's probably what's going to happen. When do you think things will go back to normal? I think at Hartford Healthcare, we see something like, better than normal, which would be like the new normal. And that's what we're going to go back to, because like there are things that unfortunately will never be the same again. If someone had an allergic reaction to prior vaccine, how can they get the COVID-19 vaccine safely? So great question. When we were first launching COVID vaccines, there was a lot of hesitancy regarding that subject because like we were worried that people may have like an allergic reaction. And then as you administer tens of thousands of doses, you realize that really the people you worry about are people that had an allergic reaction to, if you're using the mRNA, like the first dose. Everybody else did fine. The CDC still wants anyone who had like an allergic reaction to another vaccine to stay at the center for half an hour. Regular people who didn't have an allergy to any vaccine before, they just stay 15 minutes after the injection to be monitored to make sure you're okay before you can leave the facility. If you had an allergy to another vaccine, they're gonna make you wait for 30 minutes, but you can still get the vaccine. In USA, they have vaccine for another virus similar to the coronavirus? No. And the reason why, if you look at coronaviruses, historically, all they caused was the common cold. You get a cold, if you had like a mom like mine, they would just tell you, just get over it. Just like go get some rest and get over it. Half of the time, they think you may not want to go to school that day. That's really what coronaviruses were notorious for. There was an opportunity, and that's, I think, the advantage we had when we had like the SARS. I'm not sure if you guys were born by then, but this was like going back to like early 2000, 2002. That's when we first had that out of like the Asia. And people started to look at it, and then the epidemic disappeared. Then there was another opportunity in the early 2010s with like what we call the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, MERS-CoV. It had to do with camels in the Arabic Peninsula. It was like a lot more fatal than COVID-19, but the good news for humans is that it was not very contagious. So then the need for vaccine just like, again, did not really present itself. But this is all like pre-work. So then when COVID-19 hit, it was a lot more easier to get to it. Okay. There was a question here that I saw in the pre-meeting. Someone is questioning, what's the point of getting the vaccine if I'm going to get sick either way? I think I really wanted to go over that question. It's actually, it makes a difference, a big difference. Why is that? So if we go by like, let's just make a number here. Let's say the vaccines are like 90% effective across the board at preventing you from getting the disease. 90% effective. So that would still leave 10% chance that even if you get the vaccine, you're right, you're gonna get sick. So, but you're still getting a lot less chances of getting sick than the person who doesn't have the armor. Now, fast forward to really what the next thing is what's important. And that's where, the goal of the vaccine, if you remember what I told you before, I'm not really interested in whether or not you're gonna get COVID. I'm interested in, if you do get COVID, that it's a cold, like a regular coronavirus cold. That's really what I want. And why am I saying this? I look at the data. Currently, we have a lot of hospitals throughout the state of Connecticut. Currently, what's the big picture? Yeah, do we have people in the hospital with COVID that were vaccinated? Absolutely. But as you go higher into the type of care that they're receiving, there's something very clear that comes to mind. In our ICUs, 90% plus of patients who are in an ICU, they're not vaccinated against the virus. Out of the people who require a breathing tube, none of them are vaccinated. And that's really where the data to me is the most striking, is that if you want to have a better chance of surviving this, the vaccine is really what's going to help you curb it. That's not saying that people who get the vaccine do not die. But when the CDC released a report a month or two ago, it's all sinking in my head right now. The people who died after getting a vaccine, they had a lot of things in common, including a lot of them were over 60 or 70 years old with other medical conditions that could also have been implicated in them dying. And that the COVID just kind of tipped over the edge. But in general, the vaccine helped prevent you from going to the ICU, getting a breathing tube for your breathing, or dying from COVID, which is really what we want to achieve here. Could there be any long-term effect of the vaccine that couldn't be predicted? This is going to be a tough one. So any medication, there's always a potential for long-term risk. But like I tell my little cousin, to be able to witness the long-term side effects, you need to be alive. Otherwise, there won't be any long-term side effects because you won't be here to experience them. So I wouldn't worry about that. It's like basically when the first fire extinguisher came out, did the people who use it when your house was burning down, did they really care about if there would be long-term side effects? Or was it the immediate goal of let's save the house right now? This is where we are. You have to look at, this is the only tool we have that can seriously make an impact into this pandemic. And that's what we used to look at. Now, from a science standpoint, is there anything I would worry about? Probably not, to be honest. And why is that? This is not the first vaccine we made. We've made a zillion of vaccines. So by show of hands, or in the chat box, how many of you guys have a friend that had measles? How many of you guys have a friend that had mumps? Have you guys ever heard about smallpox? Probably not. What are the long-term side effects? Did your parents have long-term side effects from getting those vaccines? Probably not. All right. If someone has been vaccinated, should they still wear a mask? The short answer is yes, because right now, the first thing I'll tell you is that I'll go at the reverse of it. When the mask mandates first came down early in the spring, and you go to the grocery store, I do this for a living, and I could tell you that most of the people that were unmasked in the grocery store, I can easily sense that they were unvaccinated. That's the first thing. The second thing is that you do it for your protection, but you also do it to protect the others. There might be someone who's in there who chose to not get vaccinated because they're worried about their health. Or maybe they have cancer and they're undergoing chemo and their doctor wants them to have a better chance of benefiting from the vaccine and wants them to delay it for a little bit. So you do it, you still mask. And why do you do that? Even without the vaccine, most of the people who get COVID-19 will have very little, if any, symptoms. Up to 60 to 80% of people who get the COVID may have little to no symptoms. So you could be walking around, unless you're like President Joe Biden or someone with a lot of money who's getting a COVID test every morning, you don't know. And then you would pass it on to someone who's not vaccinated, and then that person could die. So that's why they tell you to still wear a mask when you're around others, especially if it's indoors. What is the recovery time for someone that has COVID? That's highly variable, but in general, most people should be out of the woods by day 10. However, COVID is what I call a very biphasic disease, meaning it goes into two phases. Most of the folks you see in the hospital, they say they started to have symptoms, usually a little fever, they don't feel well, they have a cough, and then it gets better a little bit. And then on day 7 or 8 of when they're really sick is when it hits them like a brick. They feel it's hard to breathe. They get high fever sometimes, and that's when they come to the hospital. Now, those guys usually are not going to get better by day 10. It might be a little longer than that, but the average would be about that. And then the first 10 days and 2 days before you have symptoms is when you are contagious to others. So imagine this, and this is what makes it very tricky, and that's one more reason to wear the mask. You are contagious 2 days before you start having symptoms. So that family dinner you went to, and I'm just gonna make a name up. Uncle John was there and was totally fine. And then the next day he starts to have a cough and he tests positive for COVID. You were exposed. That's how bad that disease is. Looking through your old questions because no one's saying anything.
There's one in the chat, the recovery time.
Yeah, that's the one I was saying. Like, it's about 10 days in general, but that may change if you get severe COVID, which will start by day 7 to 8.
I think Elizabeth had a question too. Elizabeth, did you have a question?
I do have another question, but I did have one before that you already answered. So I had COVID in like early January of this year, and I was around my family for maybe like 3 or 4 days on and off, but none of them managed to get COVID. It was weird, and I wanted to know if anyone else knew the reason why.
Yeah, so there's really no reason, but I'll tell you, like, again, like doing this every day, there was a very interesting family where I know for a fact that dad had it, the 2 boys had it, the daughter had it, supermom never caught it. And I don't even remember how many tests I had the poor lady do to the point where I was just like, just forget about it. Was almost every day for a while, because I'm like, this is not you caring for that whole family. It's impossible. Never developed a symptom, never tested positive. So it is possible. It is possible, and it's possible, especially if people are taking the right precautions. Do you have my own theory? I just told you guys how I think it started from a scientific standpoint. Is it safe to take medicine for the side effect after I get the vaccine? Absolutely, under the guidance of a physician. Yes, absolutely. Most common things people will experience is a minor headache or fever. So take, whatever your doctor is allowing you to take, between Tylenol, Motrin, or something like that. Make sure you rest well. One of the key factors is to really be well hydrated, especially it's summertime. That can help like push some of the side effects. And then how do animals get COVID, and is it true dogs are immune to COVID? I try to stay away from that. That's more like veterinary medicine. So I try to stay away from that. I know there's a lot of theories on that online, but I try to stay away from that. Is the vaccine really a vaccine, or it's more like a code to protect your person? Okay, it is a vaccine. It is definitely a vaccine in the pure sense of it, in the sense that it gives you the tool to make your own antibodies. So in infectious diseases, we have 2 terms for antibodies. It can be active or it can be passive. So active immunity is essentially your body is protecting itself against an intruder, and that's what we do with a vaccine. Passive is also available for COVID-19, is where essentially they inject you with preformed antibodies to an intruder. So that's also available for COVID-19 for certain patients. But yeah, definitely a vaccine. And then there's a question in the thread before. It's like, which vaccine is the best and where can I get it? They're all the same to me, because ultimately they all do the same thing that's important to me, which is preventing severe illness. So it's really the one that's available to you, the one that's going to your arm, is the best vaccine. That's push COVID away.
And where can they get these vaccines? If they
Yeah.
decided, if they're inspired, you've lit a fire under them and they're gonna march out and get their vaccine, where do they start?
Yeah, so have your parents set up a MyChart account for you and go to hartfordhealthcare.org/vaccine, and then you can book an appointment right on our website. I know you guys are all internet savvy. You probably can teach me lessons. So that's the easiest way to do it. And you have the schedule and everything in there.
Is that right? What I put in the chat?
Yeah, that's what I'm looking through to see if there are other questions I'm missing.
And I did put that link, hartfordhealthcare.org, in there.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Anybody else?
So there's something about the Johnson & Johnson and blood clots on the chat. So just want to say 2 words about that. So, my first impression through that though is like for people who don't have trust in the system, I want to tell them, that's one of the things where I trusted the system even more. And why is that? When that happened, we had vaccinated millions of people with COVID-19 vaccine and also millions of people with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And for the FDA to be able to bring the whole country into a halt within a matter of a few hours to not be utilizing the vaccine because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 women had experienced a side effect, that's phenomenal. There are 300 million souls over in the United States, and there were millions of people who already got the vaccine, and they were able to trace down that 6 people had something gone wrong to them, that they stopped the process, analyzed, and then reset it and just said it's going to be a precaution because it can cause a red blood clot. That shows you guys that the system works and that someone is watching over your shoulder for bad side effects. So yeah, it can cause red blood clots. And if you're someone, so to put things in perspective, and if you are a young woman who's taking what they call contraceptive pills, you are at a higher risk of blood clots, just to begin with. If you smoke, you're at a higher risk of blood clots. And if you do both, you're at a much higher risk of blood clots. So to put it in perspective, it's why it may be difficult to say that it's causality. The other thing I want to mention is that if someone does get COVID, they have a much higher rate of having a blood clot. Much, much higher. So that's that. Oh, get the testing fixed. What else, guys? Everybody went silent.
There's a new question in the chat for you, Dr. Anthony.
Okay. Were there steps skipped in order to make a vaccine quickly? Great question. So there were no corners cut to get the vaccine done safely. So that tells you what can happen if we humans get together to do something, because this was not a United States problem. It was not a French problem. This was a worldwide problem. That's number one. Number two is to say it very shortly. When you're doing research on any medical product, you have to go through, is it safe? That's the first question the FDA wants to be seen answered. The second question is, does it work? And then the last question is, how well does it work? And that's phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials that people do when you're testing a new product. And for this one, the only thing that the FDA allowed them to do is, instead of doing that in sequence as it would normally happen, they allowed them to do it all together because there was preliminary data about safety. So that's the only reason why the trials could be finished so soon, because they were done in parallel, instead of like you finish the first one, they look at it, and then you move on to the second one, and then you move on to the third one. So that's why you could do it. And then a lot can be done if you have like a few $1 billion to make it happen. Is it true that you can get COVID-19 right after you get vaccinated? That's false, because the vaccine is not live. Now, what could happen is, based on what I told you guys, is that you could have already had the COVID, and then you're just finding out because it's declaring itself. But remember what I said, like, you can be contagious for 2 days prior, and then the symptoms can then develop. So there are cases that I know of that it's gonna happen because that person already was infected and it just found out. Maybe they had a little not feeling well or a little fever in response to the vaccine, and then they got tested, and then they found out, but it's not from the vaccine, they already had it. And if you talk to them, they'll tell you, you know, oh yeah, last week I had dinner with this guy and then I found out he had COVID, or usually people will know what happened. You said prisoner can get the vaccine, right? Nope, that's not what I said. Prisoners cannot participate in clinical trials. Because, you know, there's like a lot of people, especially the Swiss, if you ever heard of like a lot of international regulation coming out of Geneva in Switzerland, they're really worried that, you know, if you're a prisoner and you're participating in Joe's trial, Joe can pretty much tell you anything he wants. So that's why they would not want prisoners as part of a clinical trial. Sorry, Joe, just speaking on it.
No, use me as an example, but prisoners can definitely get the vaccine, and vaccine has been offered for individuals who are in prison.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, they're considered high risk just because like they live in close proximity. So definitely should get vaccinated, just like your nursing home residents.
Got a few more minutes left. Anybody have one last burning question they'd like to ask our expert? No, nobody? Well, we're going to send out a post survey for everybody, and I'll be sharing that feedback with Dr. Anthony as well. So, you know, if there's any follow-up, we can facilitate that. And Joe put the link to the Hartford Healthcare COVID vaccinations info in the chat, so you guys can click on that and find out where you and your family can get the vaccine.
I really appreciate all the questions that you guys asked today. They were really thoughtful, really awesome questions. I can tell, you know, you put a lot of thought into it, and there's a lot of interesting perspectives that are going on. So if after this talk you still have questions and you want to get those questions answered, send them to Kate and she'll forward them on, and we'll be able to answer your questions for you, because it's really important that we have these conversations, as Dr. Anthony was talking about, and we want to hear from you in terms of, you know, the information that you might need. So just let us know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if you kiddos haven't already, make sure to put your email address in the chat. So the one you used to fill out the form, the pre-survey, and register for this event. So I give you credit for being here, because your name on the meeting doesn't necessarily match the email address you used to sign up. Okay. Well, thank you again, Joe and Dr. Anthony. We really appreciate you guys taking the time to meet with us and educate us all. And I've been recording this, so I'm going to go ahead and stop